Anyway, no, she doesn't do that. She doesn't do that at all. I'm kidding about that. But we saw the plan of Jesus, and we looked at that, how that he gave us the principle, freely ye have received, freely give. And God has given us lifetime. He's given us talent and ability, concern and understanding, as well as our worldly goods. He's given those things to us freely, and we are to freely give those things for him and for his work. We ended up last week talking about the practice of the church planner, of the missionary, how that, they would sell tickets. Here, if you want to come, when we were in Papua New Guinea, they didn't have money. If we sold tickets, they couldn't have come. Tickets so that we could survive. Because we couldn't live like they could. Because I don't like half what they would eat. So I couldn't survive on some of the stuff that they survived on. That wasn't going to happen. And so for me to survive, it cost a little more money. Well, they didn't have any money at all except during coffee season. And the little that they got from their coffee, that had to last them all year. For school fees and for clothes and whatever that they would need throughout the year. So, we didn't sell tickets. You can't do that. You can't do that sort of thing. And then the church of Corinth was neither asked nor were they expected to meet the needs of the Apostle Paul as he was there, and that's what we read in our text. Because the gospel is of more importance than that. It's more important that people hear the gospel than it is, that they take care of Paul's needs. So now we're going to look at this second part of this, and that is robbed from some, because we're talking about the robbery of missions. It's free for some. So when we were in Papua New Guinea, again, we didn't sell tickets. They didn't give me anything at all. And so it was free for them. But somebody had to pay for us to live there. Somebody had to pay for us to survive, to be able to have vehicles and all the maintenance that went into it. The last year and a half, we spent over $10,000 just in maintenance for our vehicles. That was it. Just in maintenance for our vehicles. Well, that money had to come from somewhere. It didn't come from my trust fund because I don't have one. And so it had to come from somewhere. Somebody got robbed. And I'm just going to put it that way because that's how Paul talks about it here. Look at verse number 8 of our text. Paul says, I robbed other churches, taking wages of them to do you service. I robbed them. Now, carrying the gospel is not free. And in some of this we talked about last week. I'm going to talk about some more things. So there's personal needs. For our personal needs, we don't live on air. I mean, you don't get this physique living on air. It's just not how it works. Something's got to go in to have this kind of outcome. You go to the grocery store just as much as I do. Some of you maybe go more than me. I don't know. But groceries aren't free. I don't hear, when we go to No Frills or we go to Save On or we go to Safeway, whatever store we happen to go to, I don't hear them say, oh, you came here as a church planner, no charge for you. I didn't hear that when we were in New Guinea either. In fact, when they saw the color of my skin, the price sometimes doubled and tripled. It's just how it was. But carrying the gospel is not free. There's no free housing, no free vehicle. None of that sort of thing occurs. And then as far as ministry needs, there's no free meeting place. We've talked about that before. No free literature. Now, there are a few exceptions to that, like I talked about the John and Romans. Those we got for free. However, the last time we got John and Romans, they were shipped up to Montana. We had to drive down and pick them up. And that's gas, that's food, that's spending the night. And guess what? The church didn't pay for that. It was free to the church, but somebody had to pay for it somewhere. The time that we got John and Romans before that, they actually shipped it up here And then we ended up going out to the airport to talk with them about, we ended up paying import duty on those John and Roman. Church didn't pay for that, but that money had to come from somewhere. So I'm saying, carrying the gospel is not free. There is expense to it. And so there is a source for those necessary funds. And that is from other churches. Again, verse 8, I robbed other churches, taking wages of them to do you service. I robbed other churches. So there's other churches from other places. Verse 9, when I was present with you and wanted, I was chargeable to no man. For that which was lacking to me, the brethren which came from Macedonia supplied. And in all things I have kept myself from being burdensome unto you, and so will I keep myself. So there's churches from other places. So not this church, not this place. That's not where these things are supplied from. And then, of course, Paul talks about his own labor as well. He alludes to it here, but he talks about it a little more directly over in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, in verses 8 and 9, where he says, so being affectionately desirous of you, we were willing to have imparted unto you not the gospel of God only, but also our own souls, because you were dear unto us. For you remember, brethren, our labor and travail, for laboring night and day, because we would not be chargeable to any of you, we preached unto you the gospel of God. What is he saying? He's saying, you didn't take care of me. I worked to take care of myself. And I preached the gospel to you. So there's those things. There's other churches in other places, and then there's the church planter's own labor. Of course, you understand, many countries deny the church planter the opportunity to work a secular job. Guess how much chance I have of working a secular job? Oh, but wait a minute, I'm getting a work permit, right? So when that's approved, I can go get a job, right? No. Do you know that work permit permits me to work here at the church, and that's it? If I don't, that work permit, it does not free me to go wherever I want, do whatever I want. No, I'm not free to do that. Gentlemen I know, when we were in Papua New Guinea, our visa used to say religious worker, because that was our status as far as immigration was concerned. And then it would say really bold letters, employment prohibited. And I knew a gentleman, he was there as a missionary and decided to go get a job. Did not turn out well for him. They knocked on his door and said, greetings, you have 30 days to get out of the country. Have a nice day. And they left, and so did he. But that's because he broke the rules. He should not have done what he did. But there are a lot of countries that they deny the church planter the opportunity to work a secular job. So they have to rely on the offerings of God's churches in other places. They have to. That's the only thing they can do. And again, that's the situation that we're in here. And it's just how it is. So we have to ask ourselves a couple of questions when we get to this point. Number one, how badly do we want a solid, lasting work established? Okay, now we've talked about there have been now 5 independent Baptist churches in Canada closed this year so far that I know of. And by the way, last Sunday night, I heard about another church looking for a pastor. So it's not like they're getting fewer that need a pastor. They're closing, but then there are other churches that need a pastor. So it's sort of a backward trend, not a forward trend. And so we have to ask ourselves, do we really want a solid, lasting work? One that can survive after the church planter or missionary or whatever you call him, after he's gone? And so the answer to that, I think it's pretty obvious. The answer to that is yes. We want to have a strong, lasting church established. That's what we want. So that brings us to the second question, which is, are we in a rush to drop this church planter, this missionary, so that we can take on another? Because, we need to, we support Aaron Nelson down there in the Navajo Nation. So they just got there. Now here's what a lot of churches do in the U.S. If I were in the U.S. and I was going to plant a church in the U.S., what a lot of churches would do is say, well, you're a church planter, plus you can work. So you need to get yourself a job, and we'll give you support for 6 months. And in 6 months, you ought to have a church going where you can survive on your own. We've been here almost 2.5 years now. Are we to that point yet? No, we're not. I mean, but that's what some people, they're in such a hurry to drop this guy so they can take on this guy. That's nonsense. That's nonsense. We need to be in it to get the job done, not to hurry up and. Now, I'd like for us to be able to support more than just one missionary. I'd like for us to be able to support more. I'm not saying today, so don't get nervous. But as time goes on, down the road, as God blesses us, as God enables us, I want to support more. But I'm not looking to drop what we have so that we can turn around and support more, because I want their work to be solid. Now, if they say, look, sort of like Pastor Rice did. Pastor Rice came as a church planter. He came with support from churches in the U.S. And then after he started the church, he'd been there 10 years, 11 years. The church was to the point where they could support him full time. And so he wrote all of his supporting churches and said, you don't need to support me anymore, because there's, the church is supporting me, everything's great. That's fine. Then fine. Okay, we can drop their support, we can go on and support somebody else. But just to look for a reason to drop somebody just so we can support somebody else. No, because again, what we're doing is we're hurting the work of God. We're not allowing it to be freely offered. And so we have to have that mindset. So on the whole, the man of God, either church planter or pastor, who has to divide his time between work and ministry, will see the work of the ministry suffer. There's a couple of reasons for that. First of all, an honest day's work for an honest day's pay doesn't leave a lot of energy for church work. Now, I know what I'm talking about because I've been there. When I pastored down south, I was full-time when I first went there, but then some things happened. I had to go get a full-time job. The church couldn't support me at all. I got nothing from the church. I mean, I got a check from the church. I endorsed it, put it back in the offering. So I got nothing from the church. So I had to support myself altogether, and I'd work all week, and then Saturday I've got to get ready for Sunday. And I was tired from the work week. I didn't have a day of rest. There was no such. Any visiting I needed to do, I had to work that in sometimes. There anybody in the hospital, and I'm telling you, I've never been to as many funerals as I preached when I was pastoring there. It seemed like every week I was preaching 1 or 2 funerals, or going out and having a graveside service, or some different something. And that's all on top of working a full-time job. All of that is. So what I'm saying is, when you're in that position, you say, well, it's no big deal. You work a job, and then you can pastor the church, or you can plant the church, or whatever. That's fine. No, it's possible. And there are men who do it. And I thank God for the men who are willing to do it. But the thing is, the ministry suffers. The church suffers. Because you have to divide your time. Not only that, the pastor has to think about his family. Because the family is his first ministry, not the church. His family. Because if the pastor loses his family, he can't be pastor anymore. So that's his first ministry. And so if he works full time and then spends some time with his family, what's left for the church? And see, most of us don't think about that. You know how many times I've been asked here, not in the U.S., but here, how many times I've been, you pastor? Well, what do you do for work? Are you kidding? Follow me around. See if you can keep up. See if you can juggle all the things that you have to juggle. I don't think so. But that is the mindset here. The mindset here in Canada is, if you pastor, you're going to work a full-time job, and that's just the way it's going to be, and that's how it ought to be. Now, there are some Bible principles we'll talk about later. Not in this series, but later. We'll talk about some Bible principles regarding that. But if we want to see good, solid churches established, then somebody's got to be robbed. Somebody's got to pay the bills. And that's where our missions offering comes in. And that's why we support the Nelsons as God leads us to others and we support them. The reason we're supporting them is so that they can offer the gospel freely to those to whom God has sent them. And so, again, how are these churches robbed? Again, in verse 8, back in our text, 2 Corinthians 11:8, I robbed other churches, taking wages of them to do you service. So, how these other churches are robbed, how we're robbed, as we support the Nelson family, is that the support we send are used essentially for their wages. So essentially, we're paying the Nelson family's wages. Well, what good does that do us? We pay their wages and we get nothing for it. You see what I'm saying? We get no benefit out of that. No, I'm talking about a material benefit here. Not talking about spiritual. We're going to talk about that later when we get down to the end of the series. But as far as a physical benefit, the Nelson family's not here knocking doors, passing out literature. They're not doing anything for us. And yet we are helping to pay their wages. So it's as if we, it's like any business. Any business, when they get audited, the business gets audited and, okay, here, you got this paycheck that keeps going out for this individual, but I'm looking at the time cards and there's nobody with that name that has a time card. They never come in. What is this about? Needless to say, that would raise red flags. All sorts of red flags. And yet, really, that's what missions is. It's us willingly allowing ourselves to be robbed so that the gospel can be offered freely somewhere else. That's what it's all about. So now, the spiritual benefits are undeniable. And like I said, we'll talk about that later. Philippians 4 and verse number 7 says, and the peace of God, which passeth all understanding, shall keep your hearts and minds through Christ Jesus. Verse 17, not because I desire a gift, but I desire fruit that may abound to your account. Again, so there is benefit, but it's a spiritual benefit. It's not a material benefit. It's not like, okay, so let me tell you something else that I heard. I heard that, and I didn't hear this secondhand. I was in a church service and I heard this. My family was there. They can verify that this was said. So we dropped in on this church. And when I say we dropped in, I'm saying I wasn't scheduled to be at any church. I wasn't scheduled to preach at any church. But I'm not going to sit home just because I'm not scheduled to. Because you know what? When it comes church time, it's time to be in church. And so that's always been, when I'm traveling, I always make sure that when I travel, if I'm traveling on a Sunday, I make sure I stop for Sunday morning, and I make sure I stop for Sunday night. If it's midweek, I make sure I stop. Even though I'm traveling, I've got hours to go. Doesn't matter. It's time for church. I always stop. I think that's the way it ought to be. And that's the way, I believe that's the way the Word of God teaches. I need preaching just as much as you do. And so it was Sunday night, and we went to this church, and the message was good. It was what came after the message that was sort of not as good. And so the pastor was saying after, he was giving some announcements and so on, and they're getting ready to have, I think, Vacation Bible School or something along those lines. And he said, we're having these missionaries come in. And we're going to give our people a break. So the missionaries are going to come in. They're going to do all the setup. The missionaries are going to come in. They're going to teach all the classes. The missionaries are going to come in and they're going to do all the door knocking, and the church people are just going to sit back and soak it all in. And the pastor said, nowhere else can we get such cheap labor. That's what he said from the pulpit. And I thought, ooh, I don't want to be him standing before the Lord, because that's not a good way to look at it at all. But that's the way he looked at it. It's, you know, we want to have a special day, but we don't want to actually put the work in. Well, let's have a missionary and let them do the work. It's like I tell my boys. They say, "Hey, Dad, who's gonna move that?" Well, God revealed it to you. I believe that maybe you should. You know, and I feel the same way. If God revealed to that pastor that they ought to have VBS, I think maybe that church ought to take care of them doing their VBS and not calling somebody else to come in and do it for them. I think that's silly. And if you don't have the people to do it, then you don't have it. You notice we haven't had VBS? It's because we don't have the people to run it. I definitely am not the person to run it. So anyway, that's beside the point. That's another subject. But the thing is, these churches, they're robbed. Again, yes, there's spiritual benefits, but there's not a visible material benefit for the money that's given. We have some churches that have supported us. Let's see, we started deputation in, now I gotta think, and that's not even fair. We started full-time deputation in 2012. So we've had some churches support us for 7 years. We didn't even get here until a little over 3 years ago. Didn't even start the church till just over 2 years ago. So they were supporting us for 5 years before we even got here. Wasn't that a waste? Well, if it wasn't for them being faithful in that support, we never would have got here. And it wasn't for them being faithful now, we couldn't stay. Because obviously, we wouldn't be able to afford rent and utilities, all those things. You understand. No benefit to them for all those 7 years of support. I got an email from one of our supporting churches just this past week, and there was an issue with them not getting our prayer letters that we send out. And it was just I had a wrong email address. So I mean, it wasn't any big deal. They give me the new email address, I change it, and we're all good. So we're all good with that. And that wasn't a problem. But anyway, once we got that resolved, then the pastor emailed back and said, now, when you're down in the area, make sure that you drop by, just come see us. We want to meet you, because this is not the same pastor that was at the church when I went there the first time. It's somebody else altogether. I never heard of this guy before. I have no idea who it is. If I walked past him on the sidewalk, I wouldn't know. So, it'd be interesting going to see him and meet him. But nonetheless, here he is. He's never met me. Most people in the church only met me once. And yet, they're still faithfully supporting us. They're willingly allowing themselves to be robbed so that the gospel can be freely offered here. I'm thankful for them. But you know what? Just because they're willing to be robbed doesn't mean that True Life Baptist Church can sit back and soak it all in. Soak in all the benefit and have no skin in the game. We need to be willing also to give. And yeah, sacrifice. And yes, be robbed when it doesn't do us one bit of good. That's fine. We can do that because the world needs the gospel. And that's more important than who gets the benefit and who gets the credit. People need the Lord. So by all means, let us be robbed so that others might be set free. Let's stand together with our heads bowed and eyes